Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the first instalment of our Cyber Essentials for School presentations, where we're going to be discussing the scope of Cyber Essentials. My name's Andy, and I'm joined here by Neil, and we both work in the certification technical team. And then we have Emma, who is the CEO at IASME. And we're here to answer questions at the end of this presentation. So the tech team at IASME, our role is to help you understand the question set. So if you've got any questions surrounding what does this question mean, that is where we can best be placed to help you. The dealing with the how and the solutions, if you've got any really complex solutions like that, you may be better directed to one of our fantastic certification bodies who are there to give you consultancy. And their details can be found on the IASME website. But we're certainly on hand to help you with any questions you have surrounding if something is compliant with Cyber Essentials. And that's where we fall in, what our role is. So today we're going to be aiming for just under a 30-minute deep dive presentation after yesterday's overview, where we're going to be discussing scope. This will be followed by questions, where hopefully we'll be able to work through some of your specific scoping queries that may be relevant to schools and to yourselves. The presentation software we're using today has got a 1-minute delay on it, or roughly about a 1-minute delay. So questions in chat, please, if you could list anything you have, and at the end of the presentation we will try and get them back to you, get back to as many of them as we can. Meanwhile, Neil will be monitoring in chat for any urgent ones that may need plucking out and maybe able to answer you direct, or we'll jump in it if needed. So schools use a range of technology that may include smartphones, tablets, laptops, desktops, and routers, as well as the use of externally hosted systems. Implementation of Cyber Essentials controls can significantly reduce the risk of common but unskilled cyber attacks. Before the technical controls of Cyber Essentials can be applied, it is essential that we can clearly define what is in scope and thus what the controls should be applied to. So now scope is not one of the 5 CE technical controls. However, it is one of the most important things to grasp. This is because it sets the foundation of your assessment that follows. We find in the tech team that the majority of the questions we get into us on a day-to-day basis are scoping dilemmas, where companies will come to us and ask us, how can they descope various items? Does certain operating systems count if they're controlled by other areas within an organisation or outside of the organisation? If you do not complete a scope fully, it can lead to problems down the line. It can lead to confusion for your assessors when you're coming on to answer further questions relating to the Cyber Essentials controls. So by the end of the presentation, you should be able to have an understanding of commonly used terms throughout the scheme, understand how scope can be defined for your relevant school, academy, or trust, understand some specific scoping considerations and important points that must be considered within the education sector, understand further scoping considerations relating to various categories of device and infrastructure. So here we've got a list of common terminology that will appear throughout the series of presentations over the next few weeks. And we've included it in the slide pack for you to refer to. The top 2, devices and software, these are found in the Cyber Essentials requirements for IT infrastructure, and then the organisational data and organisational services that will be getting added in for further clarity in the next edition, which will be coming out next month. So if we go through them, then every time we talk about devices, it's all kinds of hosts, network equipment, servers, networks and end user equipment such as desktop computers, laptop computers, tablets and mobile phones. And that's whether physical or virtual. So your virtual machines are included in there. Software includes operating systems, commercial off-the-shelf applications, plugins, interpreters, scripts, libraries, network software, and firmware. Organizational data can be defined as any electronic data belonging to the applicant. So this is all of your electronic data, electronic information, such as emails, office documents, database data, financial data. So not necessarily sensitive information, but it would include that, but all organizational data that is currently on your infrastructure. And the organizational services are how you get to that data. So it can be defined as software applications such as cloud applications and services, and user interactive desktops, mobile device management solutions owned or subscribed to by the applicant. So what is scope then? So scope defines what devices and software need to have the Cyber Essentials controls applied to them. So the assessor will use the scope to determine all future answers. If you have not included servers, for example, in your scope where you get asked to list all your devices, and then later on you answer a question saying that you use a server to update all of your systems, then that's going to draw further questions from the assessor and will likely lead to your assessment being returned to you for more information or for clarity. It's really important that you put down as much information as you can within your scope so that it does not confuse the assessor later on when he's looking at what he is and what he isn't including into your assessment. So the scope is what forms the boundary of your school network and physical locations. So you'll need to include all of your networks, whether that's one wide area network. For example, MATs may all share a network, or they may not. You may have a MAT with, say, 5 or 6 schools, and only 3 of them share a network, and the other 2 or 3 are on their own individual network still because they've only just joined that MAT. You'll need to list all these individual networks, and you have to list the locations that they're in as well. So you need to put down the school, academy, or trust name that you want to appear on the certificate. So think about what name you want to appear. If you're applying as a MAT, you could have a MAT which includes the following schools and then list your schools. Think about how different ways of working could force separate certification for Cyber Essentials. If you work in different ways, it's going to be very difficult to answer the later questions. So you may need to apply as individual schools, or again, you could apply as a MAT, but excluding those last couple of schools that have just joined you and work in a slightly different way. This could have an impact on your insurance eligibility in the future, as at the moment, only whole company certification or all the schools would be eligible for that insurance. So what this means, a way to get around that is if you can segregate your network sufficiently, you would be able to apply it as separate schools rather than as that MAT. One thing you can't do is apply as a MAT and then expect all of your schools to have their own individual certificate which name their individual schools. You would only have the one MAT name appear on that certificate. Consider your turnover. If you get more than 20 million a year in turnover, so in your outturn, then you're ineligible for that free cyber insurance. So again, that's another time when you could use segregation, which we're going to come on to in a future presentation, to divide those schools up and get yourself eligible for that insurance. So third-party providers. These are people that provide your networks, possibly. They could be your IT providers that provide equipment to your school, or administrate your networks for you. So because you do not control their devices and their networks, they will not be in scope for Cyber Essentials. However, their accounts that connect into you will be. You should still ensure, however, that the controls are applied to their devices as well as yours. This just means that they do not form the scope for your assessment, so they will not be tested against your school. So how can you achieve that then? This could be done through a service level agreement or a contractual agreement with those providers. Remember, at the end of the day, they're providing your network and systems that allow access to your data and services. So you are responsible, and any breach of that those services to that data would in effect be your responsibility. So you need to ensure that they are compliant in the controls that they put in place on your network. So one of the most important parts of the Cyber Essentials for schools, certainly for universities, that we've seen over the last year or two, is student networks. So it's really important to segregate these networks from your day-to-day work environments. It's not about potential attackers coming from inside your network and allowing them to connect in. What it's about is introducing weak operating systems or weak unconfigured devices into your work network. So allowing an attacker to exploit those devices could lead to a vulnerability on your systems. Okay, so it's not about the students themselves attacking you from within. It's more about somebody from the outside hitting into that device and then being able to do something called pivot into your network. Remember, the work network or your network is where sensitive information is held. This could be student information, including any information regarding SEN students. It could be scores, assessments, teacher records, including pay records, any discipline records. All of these could be opened up. Think what could happen if information got stolen, got ransomed, it could be wiped, or it could be changed. So the integrity of that data could be changed. It could have huge reputational impact or financial damage to your schools. So the way we would recommend you separating this network is through using something called VLAN segregation or through using external firewalls. We're going to explain more about this in future presentations, but for now, just know it's possible to separate and create these guest networks that will be out of scope for your assessment. So here's some scope considerations that we find specific to schools. So do you have a single school site? Remember, all sites need to be listed. Okay. Do all sites work in the same way? Have you included everything? Do staff work from home? So at the moment in the question set, it says that home working is if a worker works from home the majority of the time. However, this is due for review, and we would encourage everyone now to include anybody who is contracted to work from home as any part of their contracted hours. This has obviously been very prevalent recently due to the work from home during COVID, but it will still exist after, when we will return back as normal. If you're part of a MAT, are you part of the same network? So are you in one big wide area network, or are you separated? If you're separated, they're going to ask you, you'll be asked how these networks are separated, what network equipment is in use. Do governors and trustees have access to your data? If they do, their equipment and their home networks will also fall into the scope of Cyber Essentials. I imagine that their equipment is not provided by school, but do you know how up to date their equipment is? Likewise, staff school devices, do they use school owned devices or do they use their own devices for work? Okay, so this all falls under the bring your own device category, and we will talk more about that at the end. But just be aware that all devices need to be up to date and have all the Cyber Essential controls applied to them. What cloud services do you use? We're going to talk more about cloud later on, but the rule of thumb here is that if you can control it, it is in scope. So important points to remember when you're filling out your scoping. Every time you connect something to the network, you'll automatically bring in that device into scope. You cannot de-scope items using, even though we said earlier that you can use firewall segregation, you could not use the excuse of they have a home firewall to put home networks out of scope. All devices in scope must have a supported operating system. This is probably one of the most important parts of Cyber Essentials, is ensuring that you have an up-to-date operating system that is receiving regular security updates. You will need to list all operating systems as part of your scope for your devices. For firewalls, you'll need to include models so that assessor can check that they are still receiving up-to-date firmware. For desktops and laptops, you will need to include the operating systems, and for Windows operating systems, you will need to include the edition and the version. For example, 12 times desktops running Windows 10 Professional version 2004. For phones and tablets, you need to include models and operating systems. For example, Apple iPhone 11, iOS 14, or Pixel 5 running Android 10. It's important to include the models of phones because not all phones will support the latest operating systems. This is particularly prevalent in Android devices. Devices which are managed by your school and have standard user accounts are all in scope. And wireless devices that can communicate with other devices via the internet are in scope. So a point to think about here is interactive devices that you'd use in classrooms, such as whiteboards. They may not be in scope if they can only interact internally. However, does your whiteboard have its own operating system? Does it have access to web browser, email? If it does, if it can access the internet, it will most likely be in scope. So remember what we said earlier, Cyber Essentials is about protecting against low-level internet commodity attacks. So what these kind of attacks are, they would normally have started out as a nation-state attack, a big attack. The most famous one recently was in 2017, one called Eternal Blue, which started off as an attack which was called NotPetya, which based attack on Ukraine. That turned into Eternal Blue and became a commodity attack where script kiddies, as they're known, just got that code from Google and then they fired it off, and it created ransomware attacks against anyone that had that vulnerability. Most affected was the NHS back then, and it hit the news. I'm sure quite a few of you remember that. Most recently, this last month, Microsoft Exchange has also been found vulnerable to an attack that was originally devised from another nation state, from China. That was patched at the beginning of March. I think it was the 2nd of March, and it is already now a commodity-based attack. So on Friday, so 2nd of March, it was patched. So that's when it became public knowledge that this vulnerability was out there. Something called a nuclei template was released on Friday, which means that you could load a template into a tool, you would fire it at a network, and it would reply to say if that vulnerability was present on that network. And then between that happening and Monday, there's now news releases that it has become, somebody's coded an attack and made that publicly available for anyone to use. What Cyber Essentials is not about is man-in-the-middle attacks. So that's if you're in a network, if you've got access to a network internally, then going around and getting access to other machines inside, because you are inside that boundary firewall. And that is a more complex attack. So further scoping considerations to think about them. So bring your own device. we spoke about this earlier when we spoke about the governors and trustees, and also teachers and staff that use their own laptops and mobiles for work. So if the device is accessing school data, it is expected to have the controls of Cyber Essentials applied to it. So when we think about that, just bear in mind that life cycles of phones do come around very quick. Android is generally 2 years to 3 years from release. iPhone 5s are a bit longer, and they're 5 years from release. So just think about that when you think, if you're buying an Android phone that's, it was released last year, you'd only have a year of security updates. So how new are all of these mobile devices that are accessing your organizational data? In particular, think about the governor phones again and their home computers, as well as staff. They are accessing their data, your data, so they need to be secure as well. So this can be controlled generally through mobile device management, although this could be pricey and also could be technical, very technical. So we also say you can achieve this through a robust bring your own device policy. This is where you will state, things like, you will say that everybody who uses their device to access our data must sign to agree that they have an up-to-date operating system or up-to-date supported operating system. Mobile devices, if you let staff use your network, your work network that is, for personal use, for example, in lunch times, then they are automatically brought into scope as well because they're on that work network. Again, create this guest network. We'd recommend creating a guest network or a student network, and then staff could use that network as well, and that would remove these devices from scope. If they're not accessing organizational data and services, they do not need to be included in your scope, or if they're not on those networks. All tablets as well in the classroom. So if you use any tablets to aid in learning, then again, they will be in scope because they are on your network. Again, they could be segregated to a guest network as well if they're not used for accessing organizational data. We said that we'll talk about cloud services at the end. So I'm going to break it down into the 3 types of cloud services commonly known as SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. So that's software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. So the first 2, software and platforms, that's generally when a cloud provider will give you a solution. For example, Microsoft 365 will provide can provide emails over the cloud to you. However, you don't manage anything other than your individual user accounts. So therefore, in situations like that, you're not in charge of the updating of the software, you're not in charge of the cloud firewalls, so you are not liable, and it would not fall into the scope of Cyber Essentials. However, your accounts and the devices that access those accounts are in scope of Cyber Essentials, as well as the networks that those devices are on. Infrastructure as a service is a little more difficult because that's where you would rent out a whole infrastructure, a cloud infrastructure, which means that you would be in charge of ensuring that those updates are carried out. You would be in charge of configuring firewall rules and settings. So again, on here, this would fall into scope because you can control it. So when we said at the beginning, the rule of thumb is if you can control it, it is in scope. And to put remote IT administration again, these are your third parties, and we're trying to reinforce that this is your school's responsibility. So schools need to answer with an understanding of what controls this third party or these remote IT administrators have put in place. You can't just say in answer to a question that this is dealt with by our third party. You have to state what the controls are in place, and you are responsible for ensuring that they are compliant with Cyber Essentials. Most of this can be tied up through a service level agreement or contractual agreement. that wraps up the presentation part. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over for questions. Thank you.